It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning in Maple Grove. This was a quiet little neighborhood where everybody thought they knew everybody. The houses sat in neat rows, with green lawns and pretty flowers. Kids rode bikes, and birds chirped in the trees. It felt like a happy place. But something exciting was about to happen, something nobody saw coming. Now, let's meet Jake. He was the guy who lived next door to a bunch of people. Jake was super nice and easygoing. He didn't talk a lot, but he always had a smile. He had a big dog named Max. Max was a German Shepherd, which is a kind of dog with pointy ears and a bushy tail. Max was goofy and fun. He loved to run around, roll in the grass, and chase after balls. If you saw Max, you'd want to pet him because he looked so friendly. Jake and Max were a team. Every day, Jake would sit on his porch, a little wooden deck in front of his house, and toss a ball for Max to catch. Max would leap up, grab it in his mouth, and bring it back, wagging his tail like crazy. It was their favorite game. Jake was a chill dude. That means he didn't get mad or upset easily. He liked keeping things simple. He mowed his lawn to keep it nice and short. He waved at neighbors when they walked by. Most people in Maple Grove didn't pay much attention to him. They'd see him with Max and think, oh, that's just Jake and his dog. It seemed like a normal life, right? Well, hold on, things aren't always what they look like. Then there was Karen. Oh boy, Karen was something else. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the HOA queen. HOA stands for Homeowners Association. It's a group that makes rules for the neighborhood, like no loud music or no messy yards. Karen loved being in charge of it. She walked around like she owned the whole street. Her head was high, her arms were crossed, and she always had a frown on her face. If something wasn't perfect, Karen would notice. And she'd let you know about it, too. Karen didn't like Max. Not one bit. Every time she saw Max playing on the grass, she'd stop and stare. Her eyes would get all narrow, like she was mad. To her, Max wasn't a cute, happy dog. She acted like he was some kind of wild monster. But Max? He didn't care. He'd just roll around, tongue hanging out, having the best time ever. If you got close to Max, he'd try to lick your face. That's how friendly he was. Karen didn't see that, though. She only saw a big dog making a mess of her perfect neighborhood. Jake noticed how Karen looked at Max. Sometimes, she'd stand on her porch across the street, watching them. She'd mutter stuff under her breath and shake her head. Jake didn't let it bother him too much. She's just grumpy, he'd say to himself with a little laugh. He figured Karen was one of those people who didn't like dogs. Maybe she didn't like fun, either. Jake wasn't going to fight with her over it. He'd just keep tossing the ball for Max and let her grumble. But here's the cool part, the part that makes the story awesome. Karen had no clue who Jake really was. She thought he was just some regular guy with a silly dog. She didn't know the truth. And Max? He wasn't just any dog, either. There was something special about him, something secret. Jake and Max were up to more than playing fetch. What was it? Oh, I'm not telling you yet. You've got to keep listening because the story is about to get wild. Imagine this, a sunny day, a dog rolling in the grass, and a grumpy lady glaring from across the street. It sounds like nothing big, right? But it's the start of something huge. Karen thought she had everything under control. She thought she could boss everyone around. But Jake and Max had a surprise up their sleeves, or, well, in Max's paws. It's the kind of surprise that makes your eyes go wide and your mouth drop open. So, picture Jake sitting there on his porch. He's got his lemonade in one hand and a ball in the other. Max is bounding around, kicking up little bits of dirt and grass. Karen's over there, huffing and puffing, ready to complain. It's like a showdown waiting to happen. Who's going to win? The chill guy with the dog, or the lady who thinks she runs the show? You'll find out soon, I promise. Oh, and hey, before we go any further, I've got a fun question for you. Where are you right now? Are you at home, maybe sitting on your couch? Or outside, feeling the sun like Jake did? Tell me in the comments below. I love hearing from you. And if you're excited to see what happens next, stick around. This story's got twists and turns that'll keep you guessing. Let's think about Jake for a second. He seemed so normal, didn't he? Just a guy with a dog, living his life. That's what everyone in Maple Grove thought. They'd walk by his house, see him and Max, and not think twice. There's Jake, they'd say, and keep going. Nobody stopped to wonder if there was more to him. Nobody asked why Max loved the grass so much. They didn't know there was a mystery hiding right in front of them. Karen didn't know, either. She was too busy being mad. She'd see Max digging a little or sniffing around, and she'd stomp her foot. That dog, she'd say, like Max was the worst thing ever. But Max wasn't bad. He was smarter than Karen could guess. And Jake? He was smart, too. He watched Karen just like she watched him. He didn't say much, but he saw everything. The neighborhood was quiet that morning, but it wouldn't stay that way. Something was bubbling up, like a pot of water about to boil over. Jake knew it. Max knew it. Karen. She had no idea what was coming her way. She thought she was the boss, but she was about to learn she wasn't the only one with power. So, are you curious yet? Do you want to know what Jake and Max were really doing? What was their big secret? Don't go anywhere, because the story is just getting started. It's going to be fun, a little crazy, and totally awesome. You won't believe how it all turns out. Keep listening, and let's find out together what happens next in Maple Grove. It all started with a little patch of grass. That's right, just some green stuff in front of Jake's house. Max, the big, goofy German Shepherd, was out there having the best day ever. He was chasing his own tail, spinning in circles like a silly tornado. Then he'd flop down, roll around, and kick his legs in the air. Max looked so happy, like nothing in the world could bother him. His tongue hung out, and his tail wagged back and forth super fast. If you saw him, you'd probably laugh because he was such a clown. Jake was sitting on his porch, watching Max play. The porch was a wooden spot right outside his front door. It had a little table and a chair where Jake liked to relax. He held a glass of lemonade in his hand, nice and cold, with ice cubes clinking inside. He took a sip and smiled at Max. Everything felt calm and peaceful. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Max was being his funny self. What could go wrong? Well, here comes Karen. Oh boy, Karen didn't waste any time. She came stomping over from across the street like she was on a mission. Her arms were crossed tight over her chest, and her lips were squeezed into a thin, angry line. She looked mad, like, really mad. Her shoe slapped the ground hard with every step. She stopped right in front of Jake's yard and pointed at Max. That dog is ruining the neighborhood, she snapped. Her voice was loud and sharp, like she wanted everyone to hear her. This is HOA property, and I won't have it. Jake tilted his head and raised one eyebrow. That's when you lift one side of your forehead because you're confused or surprised. He didn't get why Karen was so upset. It's just grass, Karen, he said, keeping his voice nice and calm. He's not hurting anyone. To Jake, it didn't make sense. Max was just playing. The grass wasn't even messed up that bad, just a few paw prints here and there. Max wasn't digging holes or breaking anything. He was just a happy dog doing dog stuff. But Karen? She didn't care what Jake said. She shook her head fast, like his words were annoying flies buzzing around her. No, she yelled. That dog doesn't belong here. Then she did something wild. She pulled her phone out of her pocket super quick, like it was a superhero move. She punched in some numbers 9-1-1 and held the phone to her ear. Jake watched, his mouth open a little. Was she serious? There's a dangerous animal loose. Karen screeched into the phone. Her voice was so loud, Jake could hear every word even from the porch. Send help now. She sounded like Max was a giant bear or a tiger, not a goofy dog who loved belly rubs. Dangerous. Max. Jake looked at his pup, who was now lying on his back, wiggling in the grass. Max was so clumsy he'd trip over his own paws sometimes. Dangerous. That was funny. Jake couldn't help it, he started to laugh a little. Not a big laugh, just a quiet chuckle. He was half laughing, half confused. He scratched his head and stared at Karen. Really, he said to himself. He couldn't believe she'd call the police over Max playing. It was so silly. But Karen wasn't laughing. Her face was red, and her eyes were big and angry. She stood there, holding the phone, waiting for the cops to come save the day. Pretty soon, a police car rolled up. The lights on top weren't flashing, but you could tell it was serious because two officers stepped out. They were wearing dark uniforms and had badges on their chests. They walked over to Jake's yard, looking around. One of them saw Max, who jumped up and ran over to say hi. His tail was wagging like a windshield wiper back and forth, super fast. Max barked once, but it was a happy bark, not a mean one. The officer bent down and patted Max's head. "Hey, buddy," he said, smiling. The other officer looked at Karen. "What's the problem here?" he asked. Karen pointed at Max like he was a criminal. "That dog is dangerous," she said. "He's ruining everything." The officers glanced at each other, then back at Max. He was sitting now, looking up at them with big, friendly eyes. His tongue flopped out, and he tilted his head like he was saying, "Who, me?" The first officer scratched Max behind the ears. "This guy," he said. "He doesn't look dangerous to me." Jake stayed on the porch, sipping his lemonade. He didn't say much, just watched. The officers talked to Karen for a minute. "Ma'am," one of them said, "he's just playing. There's no danger here. You need to chill out." "That's what they said, chill out?" Karen's face got even redder. She huffed, which is when you let out a big, mad breath. "This isn't over," she snapped at Jake. Then she turned around and stomped back to her house, her arms swinging like she was ready to fight someone. The cops waved at Jake. "Have a good day," one of them said. Then they got back in their car and drove off. Max barked again, like he was saying goodbye. Jake shook his head and grinned. "Crazy, huh, Max," he said to his dog. Max wagged his tail and flopped back onto the grass. It was funny, but Jake could tell something Karen wasn't done yet. She was too mad to let this go. She'd be back, and she'd try harder next time. Here's the thing, though. Karen thought she knew everything. She thought Jake was just some random guy with a silly dog. She didn't like Max, and she didn't like Jake much either. To her, they were troublemakers messing up her perfect neighborhood. But she was wrong. Jake wasn't just some guy. He was watching her right back. Every time she yelled or glared, he noticed. He didn't get mad or yell back. He just stayed calm and quiet. Why? Because he had a plan. Jake wasn't scared of Karen. He didn't care about her grumpy face or her loud voice. He had something up his sleeve, something secret. Max wasn't just a goofy dog, either. They were a team, and they were up to something big. Karen didn't know it yet, but she was walking right into a surprise. She thought she was the boss, calling the cops and making a fuss. But Jake? He was ready for her. He had a trick she'd never guess. So, there they were, Karen stomping away, Max rolling in the grass, and Jake sipping his lemonade. The neighborhood looked quiet again, but it wasn't. Trouble was brewing, like a storm getting ready to hit. Karen thought she'd won by calling 911, but she didn't. The cops didn't take Max away. They didn't even tell Jake to stop. She was mad, and that made her want to fight more. Jake could see it in her eyes, she wasn't going to give up. But Jake wasn't worried. He leaned back in his chair and tossed the ball for Max again. Max jumped up, caught it, and ran back, dropping it at Jake's feet. "Good boy," Jake said, patting his head. He looked across the street at Karen's house. She was probably inside, planning her next move. Let her plan, Jake thought. He had a plan, too. And it was going to be way better than hers. Days went by after Karen called the cops on Max. The sun came up, the sun went down, and things in Maple Grove seemed quiet again. But not really. Karen wasn't done, she was just getting started. She got bolder, which means she started acting bigger and braver with her complaints. She wasn't going to let Jake and Max off the hook that easy. Oh no, she had plans to make their lives tricky. One morning, Jake opened his front door to grab the newspaper. There, taped right on the door, was a little piece of paper. It was a note from Karen. The handwriting was messy and angry looking. "Control your mutt," it said. Mutt is a word some people use for a dog they don't like, it's not very nice. Jake read it, scratched his head, and laughed a little. "Wow, Karen," he said to himself. He crumpled the note into a ball and tossed it in the trash. He didn't seem mad at all. The next day, there was another note. This one said, "I'm reporting you." Jake found it stuck under his doormat. He picked it up, looked at it, and smiled. "Okay, Karen," he mumbled. He didn't write back or knock on her door to yell. He just went outside, sat on his porch, and tossed a ball for Max like nothing happened. Max ran after it, tail wagging, happy as ever. Most people would have been super annoyed by now. Imagine someone leaving mean notes at your house, wouldn't you want to say something? But Jake? He didn't. He just kept smiling and waving at Karen when he saw her. Weird, right? Karen didn't stop with notes. She got sneakier. One afternoon, Jake looked out his window and saw her across the street. She was holding her phone up, pointing it at Max. Max was flopping around in the grass, chasing his tail like always. Karen was taking pictures. Click, 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 she snapped a bunch of them. She stood there with a grumpy face, like she was a detective collecting clues. Jake watched her from inside and chuckled. "What's she up to now?" he said to Max, who barked back happily. It was like Karen was building a case. You know, like when someone gathers proof to show they're right. She'd take pics of Max rolling around or sniffing the grass. Sometimes she'd even write stuff down in a little notebook. She'd mutter to herself, "That dog's a problem, or I'll fix this." She thought she was so smart, spying on Jake and Max. She probably thought she'd show those pictures to the HOA or the cops and say, "See? They're trouble." But here's the funny thing, Jake didn't care. Most people would have lost it by now. If someone was taking pictures of your dog and leaving mean notes, you might get mad. You might march over and say, "Stop it." Not Jake. He didn't argue or shout. When Karen glared at him from her yard, he'd just wave like they were best buddies. "Hi, Karen," he'd call out, all friendly. She'd huff and turn away, but Jake didn't mind. He stayed cool as a cucumber. Why wasn't he upset? That's the big question. See, Jake wasn't like most people. He wasn't just some guy with a dog. There was more to him and to Max, too. Max wasn't just any pup. He had a secret. A little sneaky secret that Karen didn't know about. Every time Max rolled in the grass or sniffed around, he wasn't just playing. Sure, he looked goofy, tumbling over his own paws and wagging his tail. But he was doing something else, too. He was searching. Searching for what? Oh, I can't tell you yet, that's the fun part. You've got to wait a little longer to find out. Jake knew Max's secret. They were a team, working together on something big. When Max ran around outside, Jake would watch him closely. Sometimes he'd whistle a short, sharp sound and Max would stop what he was doing. He'd trot back to Jake with a sneaky glint in his eye. That's like a little sparkle that says, "I'm up to something." Max would sit by Jake, panting, and Jake would pat his head. "Good job, buddy," he'd say quietly. What were they up to? Karen had no idea, but it was something clever. Karen kept spying, thinking she was the one in charge. She'd stand by her window, peeking out at Jake's yard. She'd see Max digging a little or sniffing the same spot over and over. "That dog's up to no good," she'd grumble. She thought she had the upper hand, like she was winning the game. She'd smirk to herself, holding her phone full of pictures, sure she'd catch Jake and Max doing something wrong. But she didn't know the truth. Jake was always one step ahead of her. Every time Karen left a note or snapped a pic, Jake just kept going. He'd mow his lawn, sip his lemonade, and play with Max like it was no big deal. But he was watching her, too. He saw her sneaking around. He heard her muttering. He noticed everything. And Max? He'd look up at Jake sometimes, like they were sharing a secret joke. They didn't need to say anything, they just knew. Something big was coming, something Karen couldn't even dream of. Days turned into weeks, and Karen got pushier. One time, she marched right up to Jake's fence while Max was outside. "You better keep that dog off the grass," she yelled, shaking her finger. Jake was watering his flowers with a hose. He turned around, water dripping from the nozzle, and grinned. "He's just having fun, Karen," he said. She stomped her foot. "This is serious," she shouted, then stormed off. Jake shrugged and went back to watering. Max barked happily and chased a butterfly. Karen thought she was so smart, but she was clueless. She didn't see what Jake and Max were really doing. Every time Max rolled in the grass, he wasn't just messing around. He'd sniff certain spots longer than others. Sometimes he'd paw at the dirt, like he was checking something. Jake would nod to himself, like he understood. They were getting closer to something huge. Karen kept watching, but she didn't get it. She thought Max was just a silly dog, and Jake was just a lazy guy. Boy, was she wrong. Jake stayed calm because he knew the truth. He didn't need to fight with Karen or prove anything yet. He had a plan, and Max was helping him. They were sneaky, quiet, and smart. Karen could leave all the notes she wanted. She could take a million pictures. It didn't matter. Jake and Max were ready for whatever she tried next. Something big was on the way, and when it hit, Karen wouldn't know what to do. So, there they were, Karen spying and complaining, Jake smiling and waving, and Max playing in the grass with a secret. The neighborhood looked normal, but it wasn't. Things were heating up, like a game where the best part hasn't happened yet. Karen thought she was winning, but Jake and Max? They were the real champs, waiting for the perfect moment. What was that moment? Stick around, you'll love finding out. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a regular afternoon in Maple Grove, with the sun shining and a nice breeze blowing. Karen was back. Oh yes, she wasn't done yet. She marched across the street to Jake's house one more time. Her steps were fast and loud, like she couldn't wait to cause trouble. This time, she had a big, smug grin on her face. That's when someone looks super proud, like they think they've won. She held her phone up high, waving it around like it was a prize. I've got proof now, she crowed. Her voice was loud and happy, almost like a cackle. Your dog's done for. Karen stood there, pointing at Max, who was lying on the grass chewing a stick. She thought she had Jake trapped. All those pictures she took, all those notes she left, she was sure she'd finally caught him. She was ready to tell everyone Max was a big problem. Jake just sat on his porch, looking at her. He didn't say anything yet. He didn't jump up or yell. He just watched her with a little smile, calm as ever. Karen kept talking, waving her phone. I'm showing this to the HOA, she said. You're in trouble now. But before she could finish her big speech, something happened. A big black SUV rolled up the street. An SUV is like a fancy truck, tall and shiny. It stopped right in front of Jake's house, and the engine turned off. Karen froze. Her arm dropped a little, and her grin started to fade. Two guys stepped out of the SUV. They were tall and serious, wearing dark suits and sunglasses. They looked like people from a movie, important and a little scary. Karen's eyes got wide. She didn't know what was going on, and it threw her off. Jake stood up from his chair, slow and easy. He didn't look worried at all. He put his hands in his pockets and turned to Max, who was still chewing his stick. Hey, Max, Jake said, his voice nice and steady. Showtime. That was it, just one word. Showtime. Max heard it, and boom, he jumped up like he'd been waiting for this moment. His ears perked up, and his tail stopped wagging. He didn't look goofy anymore. He looked ready. Max bolted to the grass. That means he ran super fast, like a rocket. He went straight to a spot near the edge of Jake's yard, a spot he'd sniffed and rolled on a bunch of times before. Karen watched, her mouth open a little. The two guys in suits walked closer, standing by the fence. Max started digging. His paws moved quick, kicking up dirt and grass. It only took about 10 seconds, 10 fast seconds, and then bam, he stopped. Max grabbed something with his teeth and pulled it out of the ground. It was a muddy bag, all dirty and wet from being buried. The suits stepped forward. One of them bent down and took the bag from Max. Max sat back, panting, looking proud. The guy opened the bag, and guess what? Inside was a big surprise. It was stuffed with cash, lots of dollar bills, all crumpled up. And there were papers, two shady-looking papers with messy writing and numbers. Shady means something sneaky or bad, like a secret nobody's supposed to know. The other suit nodded, like he wasn't surprised at all. Karen's jaw dropped. That's when your mouth falls open because you're so shocked you can't believe it. What's going on? she squeaked. Her voice wasn't loud and proud anymore, it was small and shaky. She looked at the bag, then at Max, then at Jake. Her phone slipped a little in her hand. She didn't know what to say. All her big talk was gone, just like that. Jake grinned. It wasn't a mean grin, it was a happy one, like he'd been waiting for this. He stepped off the porch and walked over to Max. He patted Max's head and looked at Karen. "Meet Officer Jake Riley," he said. His voice was clear and strong. "And this mutt? He's a retired K-9 detective." "Whoa, what? Officer Jake Riley? K-9 detective?" Karen blinked fast, like her brain couldn't catch up. The suits nodded again, like they already knew. Jake kept talking. "We've been tracking a little neighborhood mystery," he said. "Turns out, someone's been hiding dirty money right under your nose. Dirty money means cash from something bad like stealing or cheating." Jake pointed at the bag. "Max found it? He's been sniffing it out for weeks." The suits held up the bag, showing off the cash and papers. "Thanks to Max, we've got the evidence," one of them said. "Evidence is proof, like clues that solve a puzzle." Karen just stood there, staring. Her face went from red to white, like all the color drained out. She didn't know Jake was a police officer, a real one. And Max? He wasn't just a silly dog. He was a K-9 detective, which means a dog trained to help cops find bad stuff. Retired means he didn't work full-time anymore, but he was still super smart. All those times Max rolled in the grass, he wasn't playing, he was working. Every sniff, every dig, every roll, it was all part of the plan. Jake looked at Karen, still smiling. "And Karen," he said, "you might want to sit this one out." That was his nice way of saying, "Back off." The suits started walking back to their SUV, carrying the muddy bag. Max barked once, a happy bark, and wagged his tail again. Karen didn't move. She looked like a statue, stuck in place. Her big plan to get Jake in trouble? It was over. She didn't have proof of anything, Jake had the real proof, and it was way bigger than her pictures. Let's rewind a second. All those days Karen spied on Max, taking pics and leaving notes. She thought she was so clever. She thought Jake was just a lazy guy with a messy dog. But Jake was an officer, and Max was a hero. They'd been watching the neighborhood, waiting for the right time. That spot in the grass. Someone had buried that bag there, hoping nobody would find it. But Max did. He sniffed it out, little by little, while Karen was busy complaining. The suits got back in their SUV, and Jake gave Max a big pat. "Good boy," he said. Max licked Jake's hand, like he was saying, "We did it." Karen finally moved. She turned around, slow and quiet, and started walking back to her house. Her phone was still in her hand, but she didn't wave it anymore. She didn't say a word. Her smug grin was gone, and she looked like she just wanted to disappear. This was the big moment, the flip that turned everything upside down. Karen thought she'd win, but Jake and Max had the real surprise. The neighborhood wasn't so quiet anymore. People peeked out their windows, whispering. "Did you see that?" they'd say. "Jake's a cop?" "Max found money." It was wild. Karen's big fuss about the grass didn't matter now. Jake and Max were the stars, and they'd been playing it cool the whole time. After the big reveal, the cops took over. The two guys in suits handed the muddy bag to some police officers who showed up in a car with flashing lights. They started asking questions and looking at the cash and papers Max had found. It didn't take long for them to figure it out. Turns out, that money wasn't just random, it came from some sketchy deals. Sketchy means sneaky and bad, like stuff you're not supposed to do. And guess who was behind it? Karen's buddy on the HOA board. Yup, one of her friends who helped make the neighborhood rules had been hiding dirty money right in Jake's yard. Karen didn't know about the money. She wasn't part of the bad stuff her buddy was doing. But all her whining and spying? It almost ruined everything. Jake had been working undercover, that means he was secretly pretending to be a regular guy while he and Max solved the mystery. Karen's big fuss about Max playing on the grass could have tipped off the bad guy. Lucky for Jake, she didn't mess it up too bad. Max still found the bag, and the cops got what they needed. The suits packed up the evidence, the cash and papers, and hauled it off in their black SUV. They drove away, and the police car followed. The neighborhood wasn't quiet anymore. People came out of their houses, whispering to each other. "Did you hear?" they'd say. "Jake's a cop? Max found money." Kids ran around, excited, asking, "Is Max a superhero dog?" The whole street was buzzing like a beehive, full of chatter and big eyes. Karen. She didn't stick around to talk. Her face was bright red, like a tomato. She looked embarrassed, super embarrassed. All her yelling about Max being a problem didn't matter now. She'd been wrong the whole time, and everyone knew it. She slunk back to her house. That means she walked slow and quiet, like she didn't want anyone to see her. She went inside, shut the door, and didn't say a word to Jake again. No more notes, no more pictures, just silence. That night, Jake finally relaxed. He sat on his porch with a big smile. Max got extra treats, yummy dog biscuits he loved. Jake tossed them one by one, and Max caught them in the air, chomping happily. "You're the best, buddy," Jake said, rubbing Max's ears. The job was done, and they could chill out now. The neighbors who used to ignore Jake started coming over. Before, they'd just walk by his house and not even wave. Now, they stopped to pat Max and chat. "Didn't know we had a hero next door," one lady said, smiling big. A guy with a baseball cap nodded. "You and Max are awesome," he said. Jake just shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Max did the heavy lifting," he told them. Heavy lifting means the hard work. Max was the star of the show. Everyone saw Jake and Max differently now. They weren't just a guy and his dog, they were the team that saved the day. Karen's buddy got in trouble with the cops, and the neighborhood felt safer. Justice was served, and it felt good. So, there you have it, friends. What a crazy story, right? It had everything: a dog, a grumpy Karen, and a big secret that turned a quiet street upside down. Maple Grove started out like any normal place, with houses and lawns and people going about their day. But then Jake and Max came along and flipped it all around. Who would have thought a goofy pup rolling in the grass could be such a hero? And Jake, the chill guy next door, turned out to be a cop with a plan. It's wild how things aren't always what they seem. Here's the cool part to think about: sometimes, the ones you don't notice, the ones you underestimate, are the ones who change everything. Karen thought Max was just a silly dog making a mess. She thought Jake was just some lazy guy who didn't care about rules. Boy, was she wrong. Max was a smart detective dog, and Jake was a hero waiting for the right moment. They didn't brag or show off, they just did their thing, quiet and sneaky, until bam. The truth came out, and everyone saw who they really were. Next time you're outside, take a look around. Maybe you'll see a pup playing in a yard, chasing its tail or sniffing the ground. Or maybe there's a neighbor who keeps to themselves, sitting on their porch or walking their dog. What's their story? Could they be hiding something awesome, like Jake and Max? You never know. The quiet ones, the ones nobody pays attention to, they might be the ones with the biggest surprises. That's what this story teaches us. Don't judge too fast, because you might miss something amazing. Think about your own neighborhood. Have you ever seen someone and thought, "Oh, they're just boring"? Maybe they're not. Maybe they've got a secret talent or a cool job you don't know about. Like Max, he looked like a regular dog, but he was sniffing out clues. And Jake, he seemed normal, but he was a cop catching bad guys. It makes you wonder who's out there, doing big things behind the scenes. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride, friends. I had so much fun telling you about Jake, Max, and Karen. If you loved this story, drop a like, it lets me know you had a good time. And hey, I want to hear from you. What's the wildest neighbor story you've got? Maybe you've got a Karen of your own, or a dog that did something crazy. Tell me in the comments, I can't wait to read them. This isn't goodbye, it's just see you later. I'll be back with more fun stories to share. So keep watching, keep wondering, and keep looking for the heroes hiding in plain sight. You never know where they'll pop up next. See you in the next one, friends.